They said it was just another Sunday sermon, but the room felt different. People weren't shouting, they weren't cheering, they were frozen. Because halfway through his message, Matthew Stevenson delivered a line so calculated, so emotionally charged, that even longtime supporters whispered, "This doesn't feel right. This wasn't inspiration. This sounded like control." And today we're breaking down the most manipulative sermon he has ever preached, line by line, moment by moment, exposing the parts no one ever talks about. For years, Matthew Stevenson has been celebrated as one of the most gifted, articulate, and emotionally charged voices in modern ministry. His sermons are cinematic, his delivery is unmatched, and his following is massive. But behind that captivating presence lies a growing conversation, one that many are too afraid to voice publicly, a conversation about power, control, and the subtle ways influence can cross the line. And this particular sermon sparked that conversation like never before. Today we are taking you inside the message that left even his most loyal supporters conflicted. We are breaking down the tone, the word choices, the emotional pressure points, and the underlying tactics that left people asking, was this conviction or manipulation? You won't believe how many red flags start appearing once you watch this sermon with a critical eye. The build-up, the emotional swings, the targeted language, the sudden shifts from comfort to fear. And trust me, there's a moment in the middle of this message where everything changes, and it reveals far more about Stevenson's leadership style than most people ever expected. So get comfortable, because by the time we finish, you will see this sermon in a completely different light. And what's coming up next may be the most revealing part of all. Before the controversial moment even arrived, Matthew Stevenson did something he has mastered over the years. He set the stage, not just spiritually, but psychologically. And this is where the story truly begins. The room was already charged with expectation. You could feel it in the way people leaned forward, waiting for that signature, emotional build he is known for. Stevenson opened with a tone that felt calm, almost disarming, like he wanted every person listening to believe they were safe, understood, and seen on a deep level. He spoke slowly at first, choosing certain words with unusual precision. But what most people didn't realize in that moment was that this introduction wasn't random. It was intentional. Every phrase, every illustration, every shift in his vocal pitch was guiding the audience into an emotional funnel, a funnel designed not just to teach, but to position them to receive whatever came next without questioning it. He began with themes everyone relates to: wounds, isolation, feeling misunderstood, the kind of universal struggles that make people nod their heads without thinking. And once he had them there, united in vulnerability, he subtly moved toward a more personal narrative. He hinted at betrayal, at being attacked, at being unappreciated by people he had poured his life into. These weren't just stories, they were positioning. When a leader paints themselves as the misunderstood hero, it shifts the emotional balance. It causes the crowd to instinctively pick a side. And Stevenson knows this. He has used this technique for years, often to powerful and positive effect. But here, in this sermon, something was different. Something felt heavier. Something felt calculated. As he paced the stage, slowing down, then speeding up at just the right moments, you could see the audience responding almost reflexively. Their posture changed, their breathing changed, the energy in the room tightened as he moved from casual commentary into something that resembled a personal warning. And that's when the first shift happened. The shift that most viewers missed, but the one that set the tone for the manipulation that was about to unfold. He lowered his voice, paused long enough to make people uncomfortable, and then he said a line that would become the foundation for everything that followed. A line that wasn't empowering, a line that sounded more like a claim of ownership over the people listening. This is where the sermon stopped being inspirational and started becoming something else entirely, because what he said next changed the entire atmosphere in the room. The turning point didn't arrive with a dramatic shout or a sudden burst of energy. It arrived quietly, wrapped in a sentence that sounded harmless at first. That's what made it so effective. That's what made it so unsettling. Matthew Stevenson paused, looked across the room, and allowed silence to do the work for him. Experienced speakers know the power of a well-placed pause, but Stevenson used this one differently. Instead of preparing the audience for revelation, he prepared them for dependency. Then he said it, not in a whisper, not in a yell, but in that controlled, deliberate tone he uses when he wants something to land so deeply that people repeat it to themselves later. He said, I know things about you that you don't even know about yourselves. The room shifted. People straightened up. Some nodded instinctively, others looked confused, and a few, the ones who had seen this tactic before, felt their stomach drop. Because this wasn't just a statement, it was a claim of spiritual authority that placed him above his audience, not beside them. This is where the emotional tone of the sermon changed. Instead of speaking as a teacher guiding people toward truth, Stevenson began speaking as someone who wanted to define truth for them. He wasn't offering insight, he was positioning himself as the interpreter of their thoughts, their motives, their destinies. And when a spiritual leader does that, the line between guidance and control becomes dangerously thin. He continued building on that claim, piece by piece. He framed hesitation as rebellion. He framed questions as spiritual immaturity. He framed concerns as demonic interference. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he turned the sermon into a mirror, where the only reflection people were allowed to see was the one he approved. This is a classic manipulation pattern, used in high-pressure spiritual environments across the world. The leader becomes the interpreter, not just of scripture, but of emotions, relationships, motives, and even private internal struggles. And once a speaker convinces an audience that he can see what they cannot, the people listening become increasingly dependent on him for clarity. From that moment on, the sermon wasn't just about God. It wasn't just about healing. It became about him, his authority, his discernment, his position as the one who truly knows. And what happened next only tightened that grip. He shifted into personal examples again, but this time, they weren't neutral stories. They were warnings. Stories of people who left his leadership and suffered consequences. Stories of members who ignored his instructions and found themselves facing emotional turmoil. Stories that blurred the line between testimony and threat. The message beneath the message became clear. Stay close to me, and you'll be safe. Pull away, and you'll fall apart. You could see the impact instantly. Heads lowered, eyes widened, breathing deepened. The room became heavier, not holier. Because at this point, the sermon had ceased to be about spiritual guidance and transformed into emotional conditioning. He wasn't just preaching anymore. He was establishing psychological patterns. And yet, the most shocking part was still ahead. A moment so bold that even longtime supporters would later admit they felt uneasy hearing it. By the time Matthew Stevenson reached the midpoint of his message, the atmosphere in the room had changed entirely. What began as a relatable, emotionally open introduction had slowly transformed into something tighter, more controlled, and undeniably more intense. People were no longer simply listening. They were absorbing, reacting, responding to every emotional cue he sent out. And then came the moment that many viewers later described as the most manipulative part of the entire sermon. A moment that, whether intentional or not, exposed the deeper psychology behind his delivery. It happened when Stevenson began addressing the idea of loyalty. At first, it sounded like standard pastoral encouragement, reminding the congregation to stay committed to their spiritual journey. But within seconds, it shifted. He didn't talk about loyalty to God, not loyalty to purpose, not loyalty to growth. He started talking about loyalty to him, not in direct words, but in a way that subtly tied their spiritual stability to their relationship with his leadership. He used phrases like, "You don't even realize how much I cover you, and if I ever step back from you, you would feel it immediately." Statements that positioned him as the spiritual anchor in their lives and implied that without him, things would fall apart. This is where many listeners began to feel a quiet discomfort, not because he was raising his voice or calling people out, but because he was speaking as though the audience owed him something deeply personal, as though their well-being depended on their continued connection to him. And then came the line that truly cracked the mask for many. He said, "Some of you are struggling right now because you've been resisting the very voices assigned to your life." He didn't say God's voice. He didn't say divine direction. He said voices, plural, and the implication was clear. His voice was one of them. What made this moment so powerful wasn't the statement itself, but the timing of it. He delivered it after 15 minutes of emotional vulnerability building, after slowly positioning himself as the one who sees what others cannot. By the time he said it, many people had already been psychologically primed to accept the idea. This is a common tactic in persuasive religious communication. The speaker creates emotional openness. They establish their authority. They connect personal struggles to obedience. And then they attach obedience to themselves. It's subtle, but extremely effective. You could see the shift in the congregation. Some people instantly nodded, feeling convicted, believing he was speaking directly to them. Others lowered their eyes as though they had done something wrong simply by having their own thoughts. A few, however, exchanged glances, because to them, it suddenly felt less like a sermon and more like an assertion of control. At this point, Stevenson's tone shifted again. He began using phrases that framed dissent as spiritual danger. Not disagreement, not difference of opinion, but danger. He warned against stepping out of covering. He warned against voices that challenge leadership. He warned against people who think they know better. On the surface, it sounded like a traditional message about unity. But underneath, it was something else entirely. It was creating a narrative where loyalty to his voice equaled safety, and questioning his voice equaled spiritual risk. And this is where the sermon became the most emotionally charged, because he didn't stop at warnings. He used testimonies again, but this time with a dramatic twist. He shared stories of individuals who left his leadership and fell into depression, financial loss, broken relationships, or spiritual confusion. He spoke as though their downfall was inevitable the moment they disconnected from him. And while some pastors share cautionary tales, his stories didn't sound like simple lessons. They sounded like cautionary consequences that made the audience draw one unspoken conclusion. Leaving his leadership is dangerous. Some listeners later said it felt like emotional tethering. Others described it as fear-based messaging. And some said they didn't realize how intense that moment was until they watched the sermon again with fresh eyes. But no matter how people interpreted it, one thing became clear. This was the moment the sermon revealed its deeper psychological structure. This was the moment the message stopped being about spiritual growth and became about spiritual dependence. This was the moment many viewers felt the manipulation most clearly. Yet even this wasn't the peak of the sermon, because the real shock came when he transitioned into a final, unexpected shift, one that took the congregation from emotional pressure into something even more intense. What happened next marked the most intense turning point of the entire sermon. Up to this stage, Matthew Stevenson had slowly tightened the emotional grip on the room, but now he shifted into a level of influence that felt less like preaching and more like emotional possession. The tone of his voice changed first, not louder, not softer, but sharper. He began speaking as though he was no longer addressing a crowd, but confronting individuals directly. He looked around the room with deliberate movements, scanning faces, locking eyes. And once he established that silent dominance, he said something that instantly changed the air. He claimed that the resistance some people were feeling in the room was not disagreement, but spiritual warfare, not discomfort, but rebellion, not independent thought, but demonic interference trying to disrupt what he was releasing. And this is where the psychological tension reached its peak, because when a leader frames emotional reactions as spiritual attacks, the audience automatically internalizes guilt. They begin doubting their own instincts. They start second-guessing their own thoughts. They feel as if questioning anything, even silently, means they are under some kind of negative influence. This is one of the most powerful emotional pressure tools in high-control environments because it removes the individual's right to interpret their own feelings. Stevenson leaned into this. He shifted from storytelling to confrontation, from encouragement to accusation, from teaching to spiritual diagnosis. He began calling out hypothetical situations, people who feel disconnected, people who are tired of being corrected, people who have considered stepping away. Each scenario sounded oddly specific, too specific, the kind of specificity that makes individuals in the room feel as if their private thoughts are being exposed before the entire congregation. You could see the tension rising. Some people froze in fear, some began crying quietly, some wrapped their arms around themselves, and others bowed their heads as though they were being scolded by a parent. Then Stevenson introduced the most controversial moment of the sermon, a claim that he carried burdens, secrets, and spiritual weight for people who didn't even realize how much he had sacrificed for them. He framed their spiritual breakthroughs as connected to his labor, their peace as connected to his covering, their clarity as connected to his mentorship. This shifted the sermon into a dangerous emotional equation. If he steps back, you lose stability. If he gets tired, your life spirals. If he withdraws, God's work slows down for you. In other words, their spiritual health depended on his continued leadership. This created a psychological tension in the audience known as dependency conditioning. It is when a leader becomes the emotional lifeline, the spiritual oxygen, the interpretive authority, And once that form of emotional dependency is established, people stop trusting themselves and start trusting the leader's voice over their own discernment. But Stevenson didn't stop there. He elevated the tension even further. He began speaking about people who left his ministry or disconnected from his leadership. Instead of framing their departure as personal choice or new direction, he framed it as betrayal, as rebellion, as spiritual foolishness. He described consequences again: minds collapsing, relationships breaking, purpose fading, voices becoming confused. Each story landed like a spiritual warning shot. Each example painted departure as a dangerous mistake. Each narrative reinforced the idea that people who disconnect from him suffer for it. Whether intentional or not, this moment created the strongest emotional manipulation of the entire sermon. Because now, leaving wasn't just a choice, it was portrayed as self-sabotage. And staying wasn't just loyalty, it was survival. Audience members who might have had doubts now felt trapped between spiritual fear and emotional obligation. And for some, that fear began to swallow their logical instincts. They lowered their heads in guilt, believing they had done something wrong, by simply questioning him internally. This was the climax of the sermon, the point at which his influence became absolute, the height of emotional control. But there was still one more shift coming, a final move that sealed the moment with a tone that blended spiritual authority with emotional dominance, a closing sequence that made viewers later ask, was this a sermon or a psychological takeover?